So the title of my talk is Mobile Media and Time. And I thought I might give a little bit of background to a little bit more about who I am as a scholar and how I generally approach my research. So for a bit of background, I generally study what we call communication technology. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. My training, however, is actually in media. So I typically approach the study of communication technology in part through a media lens. But one of the differences is the incorporation of STS, or science technology studies, as a framework for understanding communication technology in particular. So thinking for me, it's about bringing media both in terms of media studies as well as media effects to some degree, and incorporating that with science and technology studies to understand communication technology. And there's, of course, a very long history, as you all know, of studying communication technology. I thought one thing that might be helpful is for me to share a little bit about a definition of what I mean when I use the term media. And this is based off of Klaus Brun-Jensen's work, which is media are the tools and channels that connect people across time and space and allow for the sharing of meaning. And the time and space are going to be important elements in my talk today. So as a background within STS in particular, I think there's a particular attention to questions of materiality. So the communication technology that I have for a long time studied are these devices here. So when I first started studying in the early 2000s, these are what mobile phones looked like. So you might remember the Nokia or the Motorola Razr, which were the Razr is actually still one of my favorite phones. I loved that phone. And that is what communication technology, like state-of-the-art technology, looked like when I started studying it in the early 2000s. And of course, mobile phones look very different today, and it really made my life so much easier in 2007 when the iPhone came out, because I had been studying media. I did my PhD at Penn, where they have a very big sort of media effects and media studies program. And I was studying phones. And so all of a sudden, when the iPhone came out, it was like, the phone is now media. We understand it as media. Whereas before, it was like, what is this? And how does this fit into a media history? And so much of my work has actually looked at the ways that people incorporate mobile technology into their everyday lives. And as part of that, I pay attention to the materiality of the device itself, looking at it both as an artifact that people carry with them and on them, as well as thinking about it as a form of metamedia that, so it's a medium that contains media within it, right? That's sort of the app universe within phones, and trying to think about what does it mean and how do we think about this technology, again, as it becomes so important. And then this question of like, even now, like, what makes a phone a phone? Like, at what point is this no longer a phone? Like, both of my children, for example, have my old phones with no SIM cards or anything. So it can't actually make any calls like a real phone, but yet it allows them to listen to music and watch YouTube, which are the only things they really want to do anyways. So it becomes, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Sorry, my screen just moved and I was like, I don't know why it moved. Okay. So thinking about media has always been really important to me, and thinking about communication technology as media is still really important. And so I am really interested in how the technology itself shapes the way we interact and understand this technology. And so I guess I would use the term soft determinism to kind of think about the ways that technology opens up opportunities for us, as well as how we then use it in ways maybe it wasn't necessarily designed for. So I'm also, in a lot of my work, looking at questions of media and mobile media and what are precursors to what we think of as mobile media. So some of my work has looked at, so part of what we're going to talk about today is how something like a newspaper might be considered mobile media, in that it's mobile, it's able to be carried around, you can tuck it under your arm, you can move with it, you can read it in a variety of different kinds of spaces, and how that might, how making those kinds of comparisons might be generative in certain kinds of ways. So I tend to think broadly about what constitute media, how to think about materiality, and then also how to think about mobility. So we can, again, think about the newspaper as a kind of mobile media. You can take it with you, et cetera. My theoretical frameworks, there are kind of three broad frameworks that really shape my research program. So I draw a lot on Ben Highmore's project around ordinary studies. So ordinary studies are around studying things which might often be overlooked or taken for granted in or overshadowed by the extraordinary. So within media and social media work, we've seen this around, the role of mobile phones in revolutions, in political campaigns, and these sort of extraordinary events. And so much of my work has looked at more mundane and quotidian understandings of these technologies. So what happens in between these everyday events, such that the phones are ready to get enacted at these moments. And so ordinary studies are about the ways that media, for me, the ways that media enable us to be connected to other individuals. They also reflect a kind of collective value around connectivity, but they're also highly contextual. So they're based on the context in which the national context, the cultural context in which we study them. So studying things that we often take for granted can reveal cultural values. And so that's a really important aspect of what it means to study technology through a lens of ordinary studies. Another important element of this is that often technology, particularly mobile technology and social media and a variety of other things, are in the act of becoming ordinary. So it's in those early stages of adoption. And one of the reasons why it can be really helpful to study the becoming ordinary is that in those early stages, values, expectations, understandings of the technology often have to be made explicit and to new users to sort of bring them on board of why you would do this or why you would use it. And so that leads to the second main theoretical framework that I draw on, which is around the social construction of technology, which is people, different kinds of people, different groups of people will bring different meanings and perceptions of technology to their use of it. And so Carolyn Marvin argues that it's in the early stages of technological development and adoption that tacit understandings and assumptions about media are made explicit, and that over time, these expectations often become implicit, right? Taken for granted, just assumed that everyone knows how to understand and use these technologies. And her work actually looked at the electric light bulb and the telegraph. And so thinking about how when those technologies were adopted, what kinds of values and tensions did people map onto them? And so today, I think we see these kinds of tensions around privacy and connectedness, again, being mapped on to new technologies that we might be concerned about. So the third primary theoretical framework that I draw on is media practice theory. And so media practice theory is, I use Nick Coldry's work primarily in understanding and thinking about media and media practices. And so media practice theory really calls on us to study the activities, the uses, the structures and conceptualizations of and surrounding media. And so it's not just how people adopt it, but it might also be larger structures or infrastructures that also shape the development and use of a particular media technology. So those three frameworks, I think, help to situate how, in general, I approach the study of mobile technology writ large. So my previous work has really looked quite a lot at questions of mobile technology, social media, and space. And in particular, much of my early work was looking at mobile phones, and they weren't always called apps. A long time ago, they were called WAPs, wireless application protocols. And so looking at what people were doing with these apps and how it really changed their understanding and their experiences of public space. So all of a sudden, using these mobile devices in a variety of different kinds of spaces that previously they would not have had access to the kind of information and social connectivity that they were now able to have with these mobile devices. And so the flip side to that was, of course, then studying questions of privacy and surveillance that arose as a result of thinking about mobile technology and space. Of course, mobile phones then pretty much became the primary way through which people were accessing social media. And so, and you know, of course, still are. And so I think one of the things that became really interesting to me was to shift from mobile only research to mobile social research. And so a lot of my work then started looking at, again, kind of relational and identity work that would go on questions of how gender and the gendering of representations and media use. And throughout all of this, I've always been interested in sort of thinking about how these technologies are similar to or different to historical technologies. So for instance, I wrote a book called The Qualified Self, which looked at the ways that people use media to document their everyday lives and to share it with others. And so part of the way I did that was to compare the use of contemporary social media platforms with historical media like scrapbooks and photo albums and diaries, which in the US in the 19th century was pretty common that people would share them with one another. And so this question of when you focus on the practice and not just the technology, it enables you to see things, and in particular to see similarities over time that you might overlook in if you're only looking at what's shiny and new. So part of my research more recently has shifted to questions away from space and increasingly to time, which I will say, I think space is for me at least, a lot easier to I can see it, I can kind of understand it. Time is way more philosophical and has been quite a big challenge for me. So I hope you'll bear with me as I try to share some of what I've been working on, at least in this space. So for me, one of the questions has been, what does it mean to bring media practice, the social construction of technology, and ordinary studies to questions of temporalities and mobile media? And so if we were to think about time and digital media more broadly, there's been obviously a lot of work in this area. And I think, generally, when we think of how digital and networked technologies have changed our understanding of time, it is around this idea of the probably one of the earliest conceptions is Manuel Castell's work around time and space flows. So thinking of these as sort of continuous flows that occur as a result of digital and networked technology. We also see this increased use of like real time, right, as like a concept which suggests a kind of immediacy or a kind of presentism that has to do with digital life, that things are occurring at this moment in real time and have to be responded to in a kind of immediate kind of way. This is, of course, related to concepts around fast capitalism or digital capitalism, which ties our understandings of temporal orderings to the capitalistic structures of, in particular, global capitalism. And then I think we also see this related in this concept of acceleration, right? That there's this speeding up as a result of digital and networked technologies. And so part of what I want to do today is to think about, again, if we're drawing on ordinary studies, what does that say to these questions of acceleration, speeding up, real time, fastness that we are seeing in digital and network notions of time? So today I want to talk about two different studies which explore questions of mobile media and the social construction of time. And throughout the rest of the talk, I will use the term temporalities rather than time to convey the socially constructed nature of time. Temporalities convey a multiplicity of temporal experiences, as well as a kind of potential layeredness of temporal experiences that are associated with mobile media. Okay, so study one is it's called Mobile Times and Temporalities, History of the Geomediation of Time. And I'm realizing in retrospect, that was a really jargony title, but so this is it was just accepted at New Media and Society. So one of the arguments that we make in this study is that geomedia, which is this study was done in collaboration with Didem Ozkul at Bilkent University in Turkey. And one of the things that she and I have both been studying is locational media, locative media, and mobile technology. And one of the things that has happened in mobile technology and in geomedia studies is a focus, unsurprisingly in geomedia, on space, to the degree that it has really overlooked questions of time and temporalities. So I have this quote from Barbara Adam, who writes, "Time forms such an integral part of our lives that it is rarely thought about." And again, I think one of the things that that's happened in particular academic research on geomedia and mobile media is a kind of privileging of spatial mobility over questions of temporal mobility. So one of the things we did was to conduct a study to seek to uncover the temporal histories of, in particular, the mobile phone. So as part of this, we conducted oral history interviews, and we conducted them with mobile researchers. So part of the reason why we studied mobile researchers themselves is because we were interested in both people who were studying mobile phones in the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago, as well as those who were actively using them 20 years ago. And so part of the goal was to understand both how mobile researchers saw these kinds of potential temporal or spatial biases in the kinds of questions that we were asking, but also to get them to reflect on their own personal use. And so the goal of this study was to try to, again, kind of uncover a kind of temporal history within mobile phones and within mobile phone research that had largely gone overshadowed by a focus on space and place. Okay, so these were the researchers that we interviewed. So because they're quite prominent researchers in the field, there would be no way to anonymize it. And so one of the things that we did, which is, I will say, quite humbling, it's always humbling to do member checks, but to do member checks with colleagues whom you deeply respect is also quite humbling. So Dietem and I did interviews with each of these scholars, and it was to, again, talk about where they saw temporalities historically in mobile phones, but also more specifically to ask them about their research and where or how they thought temporalities might have been overlooked or were always part of some of their own research in mobile technology. And so we were going for a gender split. Most of these scholars were involved. One of the ways that we thought about sampling were those who have been involved in the ICA mobile pre-conference. And that's the primary way that we sampled them. And everyone said yes. And then we did share the drafts of the paper with them just to make sure that we hadn't misquoted them on any of the research or their statements. So the findings, there were three primary findings looking at the role of temporalities in early mobile phone research. Oh, actually, let me back up really fast, because one of the things we did is we showed them this ad. So this ad is from the Cincinnati Microwave Communications Company. So it was pretty much an early mobile phone ad. But one of the reasons why we showed it to them is because, again, we wanted to prompt questions of like, what were the key temporalities at work? And I'm not sure if you can read it, but one of the things that it says about this is the portable that lets you talk all you want, when you want, where you want. So even in this early ad, they explicitly talk about you can talk any like whenever you want, you can talk. And so this was for us an interesting aspect of the features of the phone, which then seemed to fall out in some ways. So and everyone loved seeing those like horribly bulky, awkward old phones that were really heavy to carry around, right? So it was really fun to talk to these scholars about that. So the three main ways that we understood and found temporalities in this early mobile phone work was around the objects themselves. It was through textual content and through experiential patterns. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So the first one had to do with temporalities in media objects and infrastructures. And it was really interesting about how the phone itself conveyed different temporalities. And one, again, it won't be surprising once I say it, is of course batteries. Batteries were fundamentally understood through a temporal way. How long do I have before this is going to die, right? So batteries were a really important aspect of thinking about time and phones. The second aspect had to do with talk time. And talk time was, again, really interesting to think about. It's at some point related to battery, but talk time fundamentally was also about both duration, how long do you talk, as well as frequency, how often do you use the phone. But fundamentally, talk time was about money. Talk time was about expensive bills, right, that early mobile phone users accidentally incurred because they didn't realize the real cost structure of the phones. And this was particularly important in Europe, where people would travel over national borders quite frequently, and yet mobile phone use was really tied, and most importantly, pricing structures were tied to questions of roaming. And so even though you might only live 2 miles away, if you cross that border, you use the different network, you incurred horrible roaming and international charges. And so people were very cognizant of talk time as money. So here, again, interesting to think about how this has changed with how we think about talk time now, and whether it be financial costs or battery life, and again, how we've sort of overcome some of these and yet haven't entirely. So the second main way that people understood the temporalities and that various kinds of temporalities manifested was in the kind of content itself that people were communicating. And so the primary way that this happened was that people were communicating about when things would happen. So it was always like, when can I call you? When will you be somewhere? I am here now. I am here now. I am here now. I'm here, right? So, and this comes down to questions of coordination. And so this was certainly a big part of Rich Ling's early work was around micro coordination. But one of the things that happened is we talked about he talked about a particular softening of time. And one of the things that happened is that, of course, rather than just saying, I'll meet you at 7 tonight, it's like, okay, I'll call you when I get home. I'll call you when I leave. I'll call you when I get there. Or now it's all text, right? But and that kind of progressive arrangements were made possible because of mobile phones. And one of the things that became really important was that the coordinative aspects of mobile technology, even if they were tied to where you were really about where and when you were, right? Because you could easily miss someone if you're in the same spot, but you weren't in the same spot at the same time. And so there was a lot of communication about when you are and when things would happen. The third aspect has to do with the ways that people would experience questions of time and temporalities. So overwhelmingly, early mobile phones were described as disruptors of rhythms. So we can all remember, early on, someone's phone would go off in a talk or a lecture or a movie or, anything that was supposed to be quiet. And it was a major disruption to rhythms. But one of the things that the researchers reflected on is how mobile phones have increasingly become reinforcers of rhythms. They have become incorporated into everyday lives such that when people wake up, the first thing that they do is they look at their phone. They check their things, they do this, and then they can go about their day, right? And so it becomes increasingly incorporated into the kinds of daily rhythms of everyday life that people have, experience. The second primary experiential pattern of temporality has to do with this question of simultaneity or sharing a moment with someone. And here people describe, you're at a waterfall or you're someplace beautiful, and sometime, you used to be able to call and be like, this is amazing, this thing just happened, I'm sharing it with someone I love. And increasingly now you snap a picture and send it to someone and be like, look at this, I just saw this. And when they reply right away, or when you see those 3 little dots at the bottom of the phone, there's this wonderful sense of social connection that comes from a temporal alignment of social experience. the flip side of that, right, has to do with misalignment. It has to do with calling someone and them not answering. It has to do with missing a call and the kind of anxiety and guilt and sometimes fear that comes of not being able to reach someone is all the more heightened because there's this, again, sort of expectation of connectivity or the ability of connectivity. And so when there's temporal misalignments, it can lead to significant anxiety. So the goal of that study was to think about the ways that people were experiencing various kinds of temporalities in what we might call early geomedia. And so this next study looks at the ways that various kinds of events, so in this study, I'm looking at birthdays and anniversaries, how they occur when in and through media. So a bit of background on this study. I had been studying social media for several years, and one of the things that kept coming up, and it kind of just annoyed me, were Facebook birthdays. I really they'd come up on my Facebook feed and I'd be like, it's my friend, it's this I can't even say she's my friend. I mean, she's my Facebook friend, right? But it's this person who we were classmates in high school and it reminded me, oh, it's Katie's birthday. And honestly, I never really talked to her in high school. I never would have known it was actually in elementary school. I would have gotten cupcakes. So I would have known it was her birthday. But after that, I wouldn't have been invited to her party. It's one of those things where all of a sudden I was getting messages to wish people happy birthdays whom I would never have known it was their birthday, nor would I would have wished them a happy birthday. And so for me, I found this very, it was weird and I didn't understand it. I didn't know why it was on Facebook. And yet every year when it was my birthday and I would get all of these messages from all of these people being like, happy birthday, every year I was like, oh, thank you. Somehow it was really meaningful when people wished me a birthday, but somehow it wasn't quite the same on the flip. So to me, Facebook birthdays felt like fundamentally a different kind of social media post than I was seeing most of the time. And so part of what I was trying to do is to understand what these were and why they keep happening. And so to do that, I looked at mediated memory literature. So this literature looks at the ways that media and memory are really, inexorably linked. That we very often today cannot think about memory without thinking with and through media, and vice versa. Media, so much of our media, why we take photos, how we understand the world, is around memory work. We want to preserve something. We want to remember this for the future, right? And so really thinking of how these two ideas really come together with mediated memory. And so our understanding of memory studies here is that memory is not just a kind of cognition that's sort of stored in our brain that we pull up, but memory as an active social process that every time we engage in memory work, we are producing ideas, cognitions, understandings about the past in the present. And that the present context shapes our understanding and experience of the past. And this is, of course, really easy to think about pre-COVID and post-COVID. And now that we are, I don't know, again, we'll never really be post-COVID, but now that we are where we are in this world, we look back at the world in a very different way. And we won't, and that will always be there. So within media and memory, there's also, I think, really wonderful work in journalism studies in particular around how media shapes collective memory and how media shapes our collective understanding of historical events. And so it was really helpful to think about Facebook birthdays through journalism and collective memory as a way to understand what exactly is going on. So, so to study Facebook birthdays, I looked at both Facebook birthdays and Facebook memories. So these are historical kinds of posts that a year ago you posted this. This is, again, people on Facebook prompts you to post on people's timelines to wish them a happy birthday. And so part of what I was doing was to look at Facebook birthdays and memories, again, as a different kind of social media post. And I compared it to, in the US, we have the Associated Press, and the Associated Press every day offers what they call the Today in History. And this is a section of newspapers that is often overlooked. So it's not in any of the major US newspapers. It's not in the New York Times. It's not in the Washington Post. It's not in the LA Times. It's in local newspapers. It's in regional newspapers. And it's a section, it's often a very standard section. So sometimes it's below the crossword. Sometimes it's below the lottery numbers. It's just like in the section of the newspaper that people generally skip, right? Unless you're my dad. But it's generally not something that people read, but it comes from the Associated Press. And what I have here is our screenshots of 3 different newspapers from the same day to see how they have sort of taken from the Associated Press Today in History feed and used them differently. So typically they say, today is, Tuesday, February 15th, the 50th, 40th day of the year. There are so many days left in the year. Today's highlight in history is this. In this year, this happened, and this year. And then the other really interesting thing that they have, in addition to historical events, is they always give birthdays. So these are famous people, often celebrities, political figures, whose birthday is this day. And I will say a funny story is that this morning I went, because I was like, oh, I think it'd be great if I got a screenshot of Today in History to put on my slide. But of course, my Today in History is February 15th. Whereas your Today in History is February 16th. And so I cannot get access to February 16th Today in History because it's not my today yet. And so again, just thinking about the relativity of the concept of today in a global media environment was kind of a tricky thing. So I just show you here 3 different elements of the Today in History. And so I think there's a couple important things to think about here. One is that these are largely devoid of larger narratives. So these are not considered news stories. And if you go into most, like if you go into LexisNexis or any of the large academic databases through which we access newspapers, you actually can't get this. It doesn't show up in the results. Because it's not news, right? It's filler pretty much for the newspapers. And so it's actually just as an archival, it was hard to access them. But one of the other really interesting things about them is that, so it's quite a long feed that they have, but as a result, it's quite, you can sort of pick and choose, and you can pick 4 events or you can pick 10 events. And no matter how many you choose, it'll feel like a complete story because of the way that it's really it's quite standardized in the way that it is in the way that it's written. And so one of the, I think, really important aspects of the Today in History is I do want to call up the birthdays and why on earth the AP would include famous people's birthdays as news, because most of the time, obviously, when these people were born, it was not news. Unless you are royalty, typically your birth is not news. So it only becomes news once you become famous. So there's a question about why they would publish these birthdays. And I think one of the reasons why birthday events are really fun is because they become sort of nostalgic reminiscing about celebrities of the past. They're like, oh yeah, I remember that person. I can't believe they're that old now. Holy cow. You know, there's an element of that reminding that like even celebrities are not immune to getting older. But also there's something about sharing a birthday with someone that, again, everyone has a birthday. It's not, there's pretty much every day of the year, it's someone's birthday. And yet it's something that's unique. And it really is a kind of small, but I think meaningful way to enhance a sense of human connection. So for instance, I know my mom shares a birthday with Tom Hanks. And she's like super proud of that, right? They're like, somehow they're going to someday have a shared birthday party or something, right? And so again, like the fact that this was Matthew McConaughey's birthday, like that's now I know this intimate detail, right? Because why would I need to know that? So again, much like Facebook birthdays, I think there's something around a kind of intimate detail that you might not know. And yet once you do know it, there's a kind of sense of shared connection to it. So these two cases help me to describe what I call on this date media. So on this date media are media content about an event that occurred on the same month and date, but different year from the date the content is meant to be consumed. So I classify both Facebook birthdays and anniversaries and memories, as well as on this day in history, as on this date media. So examples are, 5 years ago, I was on this beach in Florida and now I'm standing in 2 feet of snow. Or on this date in 1967, my parents were married, right? There's this sense of this happened on this date, and therefore it is relevant to the stories of today. So one of the things that I wanted to look at by comparing Facebook birthdays to Today in History was to look at how do on this date media convey different kinds of temporalities. So to do this, I drew on Emily Kitely's work, and she's a wonderful, I will say she's a wonderful writer. Like not only is she a brilliant thinker, but she's just a lovely writer, which again, as I was combing through all of this time literature, I think I was so drawn to her work because it was just really beautifully written. But one of the ways that she talks about media and time is through this concept of zones of intermediacy. And she's interested in the ways that media and time are interconnected through textuality, technologically, and socially. And so using those three lenses, I could look at Facebook birthdays and on this day in history. So regarding texts and how the different kinds of texts conveyed temporalities, the first is that the historical year is often made explicit. So 3 years ago, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, in 1967, that element of years is very much part of the media content of on this date in history. The question of today both invokes a month and date, that is, whether it be February 15th or 16th, but more importantly, it presumes a date of consumption. And so this is why there was that tension between my today and your today, because we have different todays at this point in time. And so part of the way that on this day articulated this temporality was very much around today, this day, And this day is the day that you are consuming the media. And we don't often have to make it explicit. Sometimes we do, but we don't because it's invoked. Another important way, in particular on Facebook, less so on the Today in History because they typically did not include photos, was that the photos themselves would convey temporalities of events or eras. So it might be old hairstyles, it might be, for example, I showed the picture of my son who's now actually 7, right? So I know that that is not a recent photo. So when I look back, it invokes a kind of temporality for me because I know he's now quite a bit larger than he was as a baby. And so as we think about how the texts themselves become indicators of different kinds of temporalities, it's in the moment of consumption, in the context of today, that we see these kinds of textual temporalities being conveyed. Technologically, we also see different kinds of questions of temporality. So most importantly, was this idea that the 24-hour day structured what constitutes new content. So you would have the same content throughout a 24-hour period, and then it would become new again. And so whether this be the news feed or the daily newspaper, that becomes the cycle. And we see this additionally within the time date stamp of digital content. So much of digital content, particularly social media posts, have a sort of stamp of when content is published or posted. And one of the really interesting things is that there can be, in some cases, temporal incongruencies between the time date stamp and the content of the picture. So one example would be, for example, posting photos of Christmas on January 26th, right? Like that happens pretty often. You know, you're busy at an event or an experience, and then you don't post something until the day after. And so one of the things that happens is then in your memories, you posted this a year ago, but it's actually now the day after a holiday. Another element of this has to do with temporal incongruencies for holidays that are not tied to specific dates. So for instance, at least in the US, Mother's Day is the third Sunday in May. And so it will move depending on the year. And so, you know, throughout May, you might get images of, or Easter is another holiday, or even the first day of school. So you'll get these memories of events which are not tied to this year's event in the same way. And so algorithmic curation leads to a kind of temporal misalignment that can lead to a lack of relevance in the kind of content that we're consuming. Similarly, in newspapers, sometimes they would post news before they left for the day. And so, but it would be time-stamped one day, but written to be consumed the following day. And so again, you would have this incongruency occasionally between the technological aspects of time and the presumed consumption and or content itself. And then the last one has to do with the kind of social intermediacy, that is the ways, the social context of media or on this date media use. And generally, we see expectations of daily consumption. So both newspapers and Facebook. So Facebook's, some of their key performance metrics have to do with daily users. So there's this need to have new content every day. Again, One of their key performance metrics is not just online users, but daily active users. And of course, liking someone's or writing on someone's timeline to wish them a happy birthday is kind of like the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to social media content production, and yet clearly feeds into their key performance metrics, which enhances, obviously, their bottom line. So the key performance metrics, again, daily users, daily readers of newspapers is an important aspect as well. Interestingly, it's, as we think about the broader connections of on this date media, I think a lot of connective and collective memory work has to do with a kind of reinforcement of normative values. So as we think about what makes it into the AP history or AP Today in History, these are not new voices. These are experiences and events and people who were known, who were news figures 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? And so the Today in History is not a place for new news and new voices to become part of the public discourse. It is very much about who are the old and powerful that shaped the stories of yesterday. And similarly on Facebook, one of the things that we see around birthdays and holidays is that assuming you fit into the normative family values, that these kinds of experiences can be really wonderful. But if you've experienced, in particular, if you've experienced loss of any kind, of course, holidays can be really hard. If you've had a parent die or a child die, or you've recently divorced, all of these kinds of holidays and seemingly rituals, which are being socially reinforced on these platforms, can lead to a kind of a feeling of grief and an exacerbation of loss. And so one of the important differences, I think, is this difference on Facebook between algorithmic curation and editorial curation in the newspapers. So I was able to talk to a couple of the managing editors at some of these newspapers to say, how is it that you decide what to put in your newspaper, from the AP feed? And they said, well, our readers are generally in their 60s. And so I always like to throw in something that they're going to remember and smile about, And so, again, it becomes based on, or if there was a local angle to any of the historical events, they always played that up, right? And so here we see curation at a kind of community, city, regional level. Whereas on Facebook, it's really egocentrically, personally defined. And so that's another, again, I think kind of important social aspect of how temporality is defined differently amongst these two different on this state media. So generally speaking, on the state media enable a kind of content curation. So producers can make relevant particular kinds of content for a specific day, that is today. And then more importantly, it makes it irrelevant tomorrow. And so one of the things that we've seen is, like, with a plethora of content, it's not only figuring out what's important today, but also that kind of filtering out that this is no longer relevant and we can get rid of it. And on this state media provide this steady stream of content, of new content for both the news cycle as well as social media platforms in a kind of anticipatory way, right? So we know exactly what today content is going to be, right? Because we have this treasure trove of databases that we can draw on. And this kind of anticipatory media content is increasingly valuable, right, in an algorithmically curated media environment. And so again, on this date, media becomes this really, from a political economy perspective, this wonderful trove of ready-made new content, which comes in and out of our feeds in very formulaic. But also, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, right? Again, Facebook birthdays, they're really lovely. And I will say now I post on people's birthday feeds all the time now. I'm like, happy birthday. Hope you have a great day. And of course I get these, I get the like, and then we get the connect. Thank you everybody for all of the warm wishes. I feel loved, and they're really genuine and heartfelt. And even though it might be feeding Facebook's, key performance metrics, like, I don't know if it makes people feel good, then I think there can be some positivity to that, right? So how do we think about these together? So first and foremost is this idea that mobile media contribute to multiple and layered experiences of time. It is not just a speeding up. It is not just an acceleration. It is not just a real-time experience of time, but both of these kinds of experiences and studies point to, at times, conflicting aspects of speeding up and slowing down. They point to rhythms, they point to synchrony, they point to misalignment. Importantly, is this reliance not just on rhythms, but on daily rhythms, that notion of the day is still a fundamental way through which we experience and understand and structure time. And through media. But arrhythmic, again, these inconsistencies also arise. And that there are economic incentives that really shape media and the media consumption and the way that we think about and use media, the ways, the pricings of media, et cetera. And one of the arguments that I want to make is that that on this date, media demonstrate the way that media institutions reproduce a kind of peripheral media that we encounter daily, but often go overlooked or taken for granted. But they nonetheless serve a really important ritual function of communication. And here I'm drawing on, of course, Carrie's notion of ritual communication that reinforce social connection through mediated memory work. So with that, it's interesting. So those are the two studies that I want to talk about. I'm now working on a study which is looking at IoT, so Internet of Things technologies. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me is that it's not just like smart refrigerators and things like that, but there are these new kinds of networks that are being developed. And in particular, I'm working on a project called LPWAN, which is low power wide area networks. And one of the really interesting things about these networks is that they use low data rates. So unlike 5G or even cellular or these data networks are very slow. So they might send data like once an hour, right? And so one of the things that's really interesting to me in thinking about media technology and time is to think about data rates as a kind of temporal structure of technology that shapes what we can do with it and how we understand it. And so, for instance, obviously, if you're watching Netflix, once an hour is not going to work. But if you're studying flooding, or if you're studying temperature of a road, for example, you don't need to know what the temperature is now, what it is now, what it is now, what it is now, right? Like, honestly, once an hour is probably good to get you the kind of data you need to know, is it going to freeze or not, right? And so I'm interested in sort of, again, thinking about time and temporality and when and how slower or lower data rates is actually a better situation and a more optimized technological experience. So for me, again, interesting thinking about questions of mobility and time in some of this work. So as part of this, I will just put a plug in. So I am an associate editor at the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication, and we have a special issue on censor-mediated communication. So if anyone is doing any kind of work on this, anything that's sort of censor-mediated or related to censors or mobile censors, please consider the abstracts are due in April, and we'll hopefully have a pretty quick turnaround time. But I think, again, it's really interesting to me to think about what are censors? How do we think of them in terms of larger questions of, let's say, maybe scanning communication or seeking communication, or other forms of technologically mediated communication. So happy to answer any questions. You can email me about that. But overall, again, here are some of the references to the talks, to the studies that I talked about tonight, or today, I should say. And I want to thank you again for your time, and I look forward to any questions or feedback or anything that you might have. So thank you so much.